If Russia were to lose Crimea, it would undoubtedly be the end of the Putin regime. I think at this stage it's very clear that Russia is no longer fighting to win, but to survive. And sure enough, Voronezh was attacked again. The objective of Ukraine today is to make sure that Moscow is the front line. So today, the Russians are very concerned. They see that the Ukrainians are cutting off all the lifelines between Crimea and mainland Russia. And because of that, it's very clear that the Ukrainians have taken the initiative. Today, they're making sure that the roads, the ferries, the train routes, as well as the bridges are untenable for the Russians. And as a result of that, it seems quite probable in the near term that Ukraine could inflict further damage on the facilities within Crimea that allow this occupation to continue. Now, what's most interesting is that Crimea itself, probably within 30 days, will already be reaching a hard point where they're running out of basic supplies like food. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the Russians are going to try to respond to that, because right now they simply don't have the capacity to. But things in the very near term could definitely change quickly in terms of Crimea. Right now we see in Crimea that there's a lot of people trying to get out. In fact, the line to cross the Crimean bridge, the Kerch bridge, it's oftentimes 400 or 600 cars at a time parked just waiting to go across the bridge. There's a huge demand to get out. People realize that things are not going well there, especially the Russian population there that moved there after the annexation. And there's a lot of videos coming out in Russian social medias of Russians who have moved there who are saying, why do we even have this territory? If we came and buy gasoline here, due to Ukraine carrying out strikes on the oil facilities, there's no gasoline at all available to civilian population of Crimea. But also, what's the point of being here if there's going to be ongoing attacks by Ukraine? In fact, just last week, we saw a spokesman for the Crimean government, the occupational government, say the reason they don't use air defense alarms in Crimea is that they would be going for about 22 hours a day. So there's really just no point in having them. Ukraine is carrying out routine attacks on all of the territory of Crimea. But it is interesting to note that they have not gone for the major bridge, the Kerch bridge. And a lot of people question, why is that? Is it because they want to give the Russians the opportunity to also be able to retreat? You, of course, recall what Sun Tzu said. He said to always build for your enemy a golden bridge, the opportunity to retreat without actually having direct conflict. Now, today I think the Ukrainians probably are considering that. But at the same time, there's something else. If you're going to attack that bridge, the Russians know it's coming. They have no doubt in their minds whatsoever that day is going to come. But the more that they are focusing their air defense on that, the more that they are trying to concentrate resources on that, means other parts of the peninsula are not being defended. We've seen time and again that Ukraine carries out multiple attacks over the course of 2 to 3 nights in a row, and the Russians do not move air defense to the facilities that are being attacked. It's because they're understaffed and they're undersupported because Crimea's bridge is getting a lot of the attention. Now, this all puts Ukraine in a very good position, and it's part of the strategy here. How can we stretch out the Russian resources as thin as possible across the vast 11 time zones of Russia? And that's they're effectively doing by using things like this bridge as one of the tokens. It's most certainly possible for Ukraine to retake Crimea. It's happened before in history. If we look back at the Crimean Wars in the 1850s, if we look back in World War II, the German occupation, we see the same thing. It's not about just having Crimea. It's about having access to the territory within Crimea, but also to be able to get to mainland Russia. If you can't do that, that peninsula is all of a sudden an island. You're totally isolated. And right now, Russia is quite isolated. Its facilities there are cut off. Its soldiers are cut off. And even if you think about the basic things, like having a generator, they need the generators in order to have their air defense operate or to have their radars operate. They can't do that today because they don't have the necessary diesel. All these things are making it very difficult for the Russians to continue this occupation. If Russia were to lose Crimea, it would undoubtedly be the end of the Putin regime. The fact is that he has built a lot of his reputation since 2014 on the idea that he was reuniting Russia. Now, what's interesting about this is in public polling in Russia, when they asked the population what were the 3 greatest moments in Russian history, one was the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. Another one was a victory in World War II. But the third one was that Crimea, as I said, returned to Russia. That's a huge achievement in their eyes. So to lose that Putin might be able to hang on for some weeks or some time, but already he would have been marked as unable to continue in the role of dictator. President Zelenskyy just yesterday said that if Belarus continues to host radio antennas as well as repeaters that are used by the Russians to fly drones into Ukraine and attack civilian targets, including apartment buildings and things like that, then Ukraine has no other option but to destroy those facilities, those antennas. And he said that he gave a week to Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, to take away that military equipment. But if he doesn't, then Ukraine is obviously in its full right to protect itself and to protect its civilian population. I think at this stage it's very clear that Russia is no longer fighting to win, but to survive. Things are simply not going their way in any aspect of this, whether it's militarily, economically, or politically. And when all those different factors combine, it's a recipe for disaster, one that can easily take down a regime. Russia today is in a position that's simply untenable. They have an economy that cannot support the war that they're in, nor can it support their domestic needs. And as such, we're seeing a lot of pressure right now on the Kremlin that's forcing some very hard decisions. And those decisions in the near term could lead to perhaps catastrophic results for Vladimir Putin personally. At the end of the day, when you're a dictator like he is, you take responsibility for everything that happens in the country, both good and bad. In this case, things are not going well. Russia today is running out of both resources, time and money. And we see that in a lot of different things. Just today, in fact, they introduced a bill to take money from the pension fund, about $40 billion, and to put that into different banks that the government would have access over. Undoubtedly, they're going to be taking out money from there to pay for the war. They're also discussing, just today in the Duma, in the parliament, going after people's personal bank accounts that have dollars or euros and using that money for the war as well. There's a lot of stress in Russia economically. Also, we see within the banking sector, for that matter, a huge deficit they have. A lot of money that's not on the balance sheets is presumably loans that they've given the government for this war. So when you look at all those different factors together, economically, the country is quite unstable. Now, as far as time goes, war is ultimately decided by whoever can keep fighting the longest. It's usually directly related to who has more resources, can continue to fight, take losses, and replace those losses. In the case of Russia, they don't have the capacity anymore because they lack the finances necessary. And the public in Russia itself, I think, specifically the top class, those closest to Putin, the oligarchical class, they're increasingly dissatisfied by what they're seeing in a war that they don't think can be won anymore, and a war that's simply destroying Russia economically. The objective of Ukraine today is to make sure that Moscow is the front line and that the war is being fought in Russia, not in Ukraine. I think that's where a lot of people get the war wrong. They imagine the war in Ukraine about being the territory in Donbass, for instance. In fact, it's not. Right now, Ukraine's primary objective is inflict damage on Russia from within the territory of the Russian Federation. And that's a huge change. That gives Ukraine a massive advantage against Russia because now it has the capacity to attack things like the oil refineries, which dry up the national budget of Russia. About 45% of the national budget comes from oil and gas. So when you're able to take large amounts of that offline, that's something that has a secondary effect across the entire Russian economy, not just those industries, but also affects the rest of the private sector and the public sector, and it's affecting the war effort of the Russians. We've seen Russia spending incredible sums of money, about $22 billion so far, just to rebuild the refineries that Ukraine has destroyed. And that's why Ukraine is carrying out the attacks routinely on some of these facilities 2 or 3 or 4 times, is to make sure that they truly burn them down to the ground. There's nothing left to rebuild. For Russia, rebuilding is difficult for a number of different reasons. For one, they had modern infrastructure in many of these facilities. That means that they had Western-made parts. But today, due to sanctions, they can't get those parts. But even if they can, the black market makes them prohibitively expensive, especially when you're not making income anymore from oil. The situation is so dire today in Russia, it's no longer just a question of exporting oil at what price. It's about whether or not they will have enough gasoline for their own population. Exporting is already becoming very questionable. They have problems with their pipelines, and they're having problems at the central facilities. Overall, for Russia, the ability to continue in the game of oil markets is going to be very challenging. So today we can argue that Ukraine has put itself into a very good position by continuing these attacks, and it's something that is promised to continue for the time to come. As we've seen, Ukraine is increasingly focusing on attacking the nodes that Russia needs in order to continue this war. So it's not just the oil industry that gets a lot of attention because it makes a lot of very big flames. But when you attack something like the facility in Voronezh that makes semiconductors, that's huge. The Russians have very few facilities that make semiconductors. It's a big problem for them. But more than that, it's something that causes the Russians to, again, invest resources in its defense, invest more and more money in making sure that facilities like that are not attacked, which thereby leaves other facilities, like ones in Moscow or ones in Crimea, unprotected. So the idea is, how do we get the Russians across the entire court, running back and forth and not able to defend a single point? But in the case of semiconductors, the Russians are using them for things like missiles. So when you destroy a facility like that, it makes it impossible for Russians downstream to be able to carry out attacks in Ukraine. This is something that allows them to shape the battlefield in Ukraine by attacking things within Russia. We often see before and after attacks on facilities in Russia that there's satellite photos. What's the purpose of that? Well, it has a couple different purposes. For one, the before photos is to help with the targeting. What needs to be struck, which of the facilities is currently operating, which is currently offline, determine things like that. But after the attack, they have to see, has it been permanently taken offline, or is this something that they're recovering from? Are they already in the process of reconstruction? In which case, it might bear to again strike that facility a couple weeks down the road once they've put more of the valuable resources they have into fixing the facility. Ukraine has been very good and very disciplined about scouting out different targets, making sure that they find the very best targets, and going after the most critical nodes in Russia. For instance, in the case of chemicals, they oftentimes go after the chemical factories that are the only factories in the country that produce a particular chemical compound. And it's sort of surprising to say that in an entire country there'll only be one facility, but in Russia, that's often the case. And because of that, by targeting that, that might be something that disrupts the production of explosives, as we just saw recently an attack on a chemical factory in Russia that was able to then stop Russia's ability to continue producing weapons in the war. Overall, we have to understand that Ukraine's strategy at this point is not just to defend Ukrainian territory in Ukraine, it's to bring the war to Russia. But from that point on out, it's something even more interesting. It's to make it untenable for the Putin regime to continue its war, but also for it to remain in power. If they keep putting enough pressure now, it is very realistic they bring about the end of the Putin regime, and that's the objective.